Assalamu Alaikum.
Walaikum Assalam, Baba.
So, are you ready for today's story?
Yes.
Alright, now listen carefully. Bismillah. In the last episode, we saw how Yusuf alayhi salam was put in prison in spite of being innocent. It was in the prison that the Prophet had to face his third test. It was during this period that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blessed him with an extraordinary gift. The Prophet was blessed with the ability to interpret dreams. The people in the prison knew that Yusuf alayhi salam was a noble young man with great knowledge and a merciful heart. They loved and respected him. At about the same time, two other men landed in the prison. One was the cupbearer of the king, and the other was the king's cook. That night, both the new inmates had a strange dream. When they woke up, they were confused as they could not understand the meaning of the dream. The next day, when they saw the Prophet, they realized that he was not a common criminal. They approached him and told him about their dream. I had a very strange dream. I saw that I was standing in a place with bread on my head. There were two birds eating the bread on top of my head. On hearing this, the Prophet first called them to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He told them the meaning of his dream. The dream meant that the cook was going to be crucified until he died. Then the Prophet asked the cupbearer to tell him about his dream. I saw that I was standing inside the palace, said the cupbearer, and I was serving wine to the king. The Prophet prayed for some time and he said that the cupbearer will be soon let free and that he will return to the service of the king. The Prophet then asked the cupbearer to talk to the king about him and tell him that there was a wronged soul named Yusuf in the prison. What the Prophet predicted soon happened, and the cook was crucified just like the Prophet foretold. The cupbearer returned to the palace as well. But as soon as he returned to service, Shaitan made him forget about the Prophet, and therefore Yusuf alayhi salam remained in prison for a few more years. After a few years, one night the king was sleeping in his palace. The king had a strange dream that night. And in his dream, he saw that he was standing at the banks of River Nile. He saw that the water was receding, revealing the bare mud. He saw the fish skipping and jumping without water. Then he saw 7 fat cows emerging from the water, followed by 7 lean cows. The lean cows then began swallowing the fat cows. The king was terrified seeing this. He then saw 7 ears of green corn growing by the riverbank. Suddenly they disappeared, and in its place grew 7 dry ears of corn. The king woke up terrified from his dream. He was shocked and depressed, as he could not understand the meaning of his dream. The next day, he called his ministers, priests, and advisors and told them about his dream. The sorcerers said, "This is a very confusing dream. How can any of that happen?" The priest said, "Perhaps you had a heavy dinner. Maybe you slept without a blanket," said the chief minister. All of them said it was only a nightmare and there was nothing to worry about. The news reached the cupbearer. He recollected the dream that he had while he was in prison, and suddenly he remembered Yusuf alayhi salam. He ran to the king to tell him about the Prophet. "He had asked me to tell you about his innocence he said to the king, "But I forgot." When he explained how Yusuf alayhi salam had interpreted his dream while in prison, king sent him to meet the prophet. The cupbearer met the prophet and told him about the king's dream. The prophet prayed to Allah and then explained the meaning of the dream. There will be 7 years of rich harvest in the kingdom, he said. If the land is cultivated properly, there will be a good harvest, and people will have more than enough food. This will be followed by 7 years of drought in the kingdom. People will not have enough to eat, and there will be scarcity of food all over Egypt. When the cupbearer told the king about the interpretation, the king was fascinated. He commanded that Yusuf alayhi salam be set free and presented before him at once. When the king's envoy arrived at the prison to set him free, the prophet refused to leave the prison. "I will not leave the prison until my innocence is proven," he told them. The envoy returned to the king. "Where is Yusuf?" asked the king. "Did I not command you to fetch him?" "He refused to leave until his innocence is established," they replied. The king realized that the prophet was unfairly put in prison, so he immediately ordered an inquiry. Zulaykha, wife of the chief minister, was brought into his court, and so were the wives of the other ministers who had attended the lavish banquet. "What is the story of Yusuf?" the king asked them. "Is it true that he tried to molest the chief minister's wife?" "He didn't do anything," said one woman. "He did her no harm," said another. "He is innocent as the angels," said another. Everyone's attention now turned to Zulaykha. She now wore a wrinkled face. She was overwhelmed with sorrow while the prophet was in prison. "I tempted him, but he refused," she boldly confessed. "So he is innocent as he says," said the king. When the prophet came to the palace, the king was stunned by this handsome young man. He spoke to the prophet for a while to test his knowledge. The replies of the prophet stunned the king, and he was convinced that he was very intelligent indeed. Then the conversation turned to the dream. The prophet advised the king to start planning for years of famine ahead. He informed the king that the famine would not only affect Egypt, but all other neighboring countries as well. The king then appointed the prophet as the controller of granaries. It was his responsibility to guard the nation's harvest and make plans for the anticipated famine. The wheels of time had turned by now. The prophet, who was in prison till a few months ago, had now become one of the senior-most officials in Egypt. During the 7 good years that followed, the prophet had full control over the cultivation, harvesting, and storage of crops. He did his duties faithfully, and he carefully saved the grains for the harsh years ahead.
What happened next?
I will tell you the remaining story tomorrow.
Mashallah, that was such a wonderful story. Baba, did the prophet ever see his father again?
You will have to wait till tomorrow to know that.
Okay.
So are you ready for the questions?
Yes.
Alright, now tell me, what were the occupation of the 2 men who landed in prison along with the prophet?
One was a cook and the other was a cupbearer.
That's correct. Now tell me about the king's dream.
The king dreamt that he was standing at the banks of River Nile. While he was standing there, he saw 7 fat cows coming out of the water, and then 7 lean cows came out. The lean cows then swallowed the fat cows.
MashaAllah, and what about the rest?
Then the king saw 7 green ears of corn growing by the river. These green ears disappeared, and in its place there was 7 dry ears of corn.
And what did the dream mean?
The dream meant that the country was going to receive a rich harvest for the next 7 years, and then there was going to be 7 long years of drought.
That's very good. Why did the prophet refuse to come out of the prison?
The prophet wanted his innocence to be proved. That's why he stayed in the prison.
That's right again. And how did the king prove his innocence?
The king called the wife of chief minister along with other women and questioned them. But this time everyone said the truth, and the prophet was proved innocent.
That's correct, my son. And now for the last question. What position did the king offer the prophet?
The prophet was made the controller of granaries.
MashaAllah, you gave all the right answers, my son. Now that's all for today. I will tell you the remaining story tomorrow. Good night.
Good night, Baba.